Thanks so much for inviting me, Huda. I'm glad to be back. Yeah, it was 2018 when I was a unit leader at Unit 15X, so it's been 2 years. So yeah, it's really great to be back. So with the interest of time, I'm going to dive right into the presentation. So I'll share my screen, and I want to encourage everyone to ask questions as I go along, and then we'll address them. I named the discussion Advocating for Architecture because, as Huda mentioned with the introduction, I find myself having to make a case for the use of architecture in my context, and I'll explain in detail. Need to move, there we go. Sorry, I skipped. In this image, this is an image of Kampala. I actually took this on a flight back from South Africa, where the airplane flew over Kampala, then landed in Entebbe. So what we see here are different hills. Kampala was built originally on 7 hills. Now there's many more hills. And these are the wetlands in between the hills that are seen as the last place to build. The city has been growing really fast. And I'll talk about that later in the presentation. I'm going to start by going back in history. So a very brief history about Kampala is that it used to be the Kingdom of Uganda. And what we see here is a very first sketch made in the 1800s by a British explorer. And at the top of the hill is the King's Palace, and this is a road leading up to it. What I would say about pre-colonial times is the idea of building for permanency didn't exist at the time. So all the materials were thatch, wood, reeds, and even the King's Palace, when a new king came, he built his palace on the top of a different hill. So the palace wasn't meant to last forever. And it's just something to bear in mind as we move along. And in this image, we see the first British explorers that came to Uganda in 1827. There's Speak and Grant. Those are 2 figures that you see in the middle here, and they're talking to the king at the time, who was Mutesa. One thing I want to pause and point out is I looked very quickly at when the first Europeans came to South Africa, and it was 1488. So there's a difference of over 300 years. And why it's important to point this out is that by the time the European explorers came to Uganda, one, there was an awareness of the challenges. For example, the king, this is an old photograph. It's believed to be the only photograph of that particular king taken in 1875. Was aware of land issues, for example. They didn't readily give out land. And they signed careful contracts moving forward with the different British, I'd say, administrators that came over time. Eventually, Buganda fell under the control of the British colonial government. I would also point out that it wasn't a colony, it was a protectorate. And I'll read an excerpt of a book. This is a book by Richard Upjohn, written in 1941. The book is called Focus on Africa, and he explains the approach that the British government took towards Buganda. So I'll quote, "The governing policy in Uganda seemed to have been a nature of a closely controlled experiment. The existing kingdom of Great Buganda tribes supplied a well-developed political organization in which to build. There was a king, or kabaka, there was a parliament, or a lukiko, and a system of great chiefs and subordinate chiefs. The structure was retained intact." So moving forward, 1950s, by now Uganda is a British protectorate, and the architect Ernst May, who's a German architect who had moved to East Africa, did the very first plan of Kampala. He used the garden city planning approach, looking at each hill as its own city. So that's what we see here in this diagram, the first 7 hills. And a plan that also shows the infrastructure, now the roads and all this going through the hills. And what we see in green are the wetlands, which were left in place. What I'll say about the wetlands also is that the Baganda saw the wetlands as a spiritual place, a place for renewal. And during this colonial times, they were seen as wastelands. They're actually written down in documents as wastelands, like a wasted area that couldn't be used. And they were kind of left also as buffers between the hills. But also layered under this was race. So while the city was being planned, the British colonial government assumed that they were planning for themselves. They hadn't anticipated independence. So what you see is European zones, Asian meaning Indian, and African zones. And what's very interesting about this plan is that there's a direct link to the town planning that was going on in South Africa. There are articles, and I can share afterwards, that show that what was happening at this time is the different colonial governments in the different colonies were saying, okay, what is the issue? What are we going to do about, I guess the question was, would Africans urbanize? And there was a case for no, a case for yes, and then South Africa was the most progressed, and what was going on there was the segregated approach to town planning, and this idea was taken from there and applied over here. And I think it's just important to understand that we're all connected, from way back. And there's a tendency to think we're very separate, but we're not. And there was a lot of communication going across these different leaders at the time. And so now I'm going to fast forward to independence. Our independence was 1962. What I'll say about this is because Uganda was a British protectorate, and a lot of structures that were left in place, the average person didn't actually even realize that it had turned into a protectorate, because the king was still there, the chiefs were still there, everything kind of looked the same. So the process of gaining independence was not violent. For example, if in comparison to Kenya, that was a colony. Kenya was a colony. There was a lot of land taken over by British farmers, and the Mama rebellion was very aggressive in order for them to gain independence. What happened in Uganda was a series of meetings and demonstrations in order to get documents unsigned towards independence. And what we see in the middle here actually is the first parliament, which initially was a building that was going to be a legislation building. And then when independence became more and more clear that that's the direction it was going, it was then changed into a parliament. Also, what's interesting to note is that this time the city was being planned for 50,000 people. Very low density, the highest buildings are about 4 stories high, there's a lot of open space. So this is the parliament, these are government buildings. There's a theater here, the National Theater. I'll talk about it more. And then fast forward to today, a city that was built for 50,000 people now has 3 million people. And the infrastructure hasn't really improved much since the times before, because shortly after independence, there was a time of optimism, and then unfortunately we fell into a series of one war after the other, and a lot of political trouble that kind of stalled development. And this, we more or less, our independence was 62, but we more or less started all over again in 85 when our current president came into power. And so there hasn't been much growth, but the population has increased dramatically. And so I'll talk about the impact of that shortly. So just to touch again on the architecture of independence, what we see here is the Independence Arc that was built in front of the parliament. The way this happened is that the president at the time, President Obote, had seen the Independence Arc in Ghana. He traveled to Ghana and came back and said he wanted one in front of the parliament. And this coin here has some medallion, like a piece on it. Eventually it was taken down when he wasn't in power. But what this shows is the amount of funding that went into these kinds of projects, because this is a very expensive piece of architecture to add at the end. These slender, tall columns, the kind of reinforcing needed is really a lot. These photos were taken by a Ugandan engineer called Mwamba. He didn't only take this, he also took these are the photos, which is a new sports ground under construction at the time. And what you see in these photos is just a lot of optimism and a lot of spending on this new nation that was being built. What I'm going to do now is quickly show you a video to explain how I got into doing the research on the history of architecture in Uganda. There was a project called African Modernism, led by Manuel Hertz, a German architect, looking at the modernist buildings in Africa. And when this exhibition came to Uganda, we wanted to add Kampala to the exhibition. Initially, it had Ghana, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Zambia, and the fifth one. And so we wanted to add Africa so it would apply to this context. In the process of, we started out with a workshop to start to identify these buildings and find the stories. And to our surprise, it was very difficult to find information. So I'll show you the video in. The African Modernism Kampala workshop has been a really great experience. We explored the relationship between architecture and photography. What we chose to do was have a photography student paired with an architecture student and go to look at a selected building and see what comes out of that collaboration.
Putting those two more or less traditionally separate practices, semi-separate sort of disciplines together in a workshop and to make collaborations, I think was really a great way to think about photography.
Before, I used to believe that photography is only about taking pictures, but after meeting my fellow friend today, I realized that photography is much more than that. It's about telling a story about the building. It's about telling a story between the people and the building.
You find most people look at these buildings as very recent and, there's nothing special to them, but I think this workshop gives us the opportunity to uncover the hidden stories behind these buildings.
Generally, we've seen several buildings that were fantastic. I've seen the coffee board building with its colorful facade that is so playful and wonderful. We've seen the student housing at the university, which is quite amazing, and several others. Like the Uganda house in its strict precision, which has a very high quality.
The most interesting part of the workshop for me was the conversation that we had with architect Philip Cuttin, who is part of an old British firm that did most of the buildings during the independence time, and hearing his story about the decisions behind the materials chosen, the form that was chosen, what was happening at that time. I'm hoping that we can record all this information before it gets lost. Just to reiterate what was said in the video, we had to collect a lot of information and it was actually very difficult. One good thing is a lot of these projects were actually done by the one British architecture firm, Pitfield and Bogner. For example, this building, Uganda House, this shows the construction at the time, the kind of site models they had to make before it was built. And then this is a photo, it's an old photo, but the building doesn't look that much different now. I'll show it another photo. It's another building by them, Cham Towers. It used to be called the Uganda Commercial Bank. Another building by the same architecture firm, it's the National Theatre. And this is just a series of different buildings. And what I'll say that they all have in common is that there were nation building buildings. This is a residence at the university, for example, and so is this one. This is the coffee marketing board for the production of coffee. So the idea behind the funding of these buildings, which a lot of them, according to Philip Cuttin, the architect, said a lot of his funding came from the UN, because the UN had one of their mandates that they called Eco Rights for All, and so they wanted to support the building of the new nations, and that's supported a lot of these buildings. A challenge that we found with finding the information, what this slide shows is at some point we got stuck because we couldn't find simple information like who was the architect, if it wasn't Pitfield and Bogner, who was the architect, when was it built, just like information about the buildings was unable to find it because most of the archives were destroyed during the the war periods in Uganda. And just as we'd hit a hard wall, I saw this post on Instagram from a friend of mine, and she says, today, a cover find, Alison and Peter Smithson, Uganda Electrical Board. And so I emailed her and say, you know, where did you find this? And turns out she's doing her own research in the British Archives. And we added her to the project to look for what we wanted. And she sent, most of these were postcards. So what you see here, old postcards, this is very, it says 1897. This is Kampala in 1897. This is probably a little later, I'm not sure the date. This building is the very first permanent building built in Kampala. It was used as a fort first, and then as a museum, and then eventually led to Uganda Museum. That's a whole other story. And this is one of the main streets in Kampala, also a postcard. So Riggs, the researcher, was able to find this information in the British Archives and send it to us in order to complete the stories around the buildings. I've since built tour guide of these buildings where they're open to the public, and we tell stories about the buildings and the journey through the workshop. And with each tour, I find out more information. Sometimes the people taking the tour know either just personal stories or they know about other personal archives. And so it's kind of an ongoing project to collect information. And then, as Huda mentioned earlier, I'm now one of the researchers in the Center for Architecture, for the Canadian Center of Architecture Mellon project, and where it's looking at centering Africa. And my proposal for this project is to pick one building, which is Women's Hall at the university, and really find not only the historic information about it, but also how the building's being used now. Because the way the city was envisioned in the 60s is very different from the way that is evolved to now. And the way the buildings are being used by the current users in the contemporary city is very different. So taking this building as a case study, we're going to look at how the buildings have been adapted to change to the current use of the buildings, and telling this story through the view of the local user. So I'm going to switch now to a very different topic and just tell you about Unit 15X. I heard from Huda some of the students here in Unit 15X, so you might find this interesting. This was 2 years ago. What I want to do is just bring us to now, like what's going on now. And with Unit 15X, we had the opportunity of looking at what the challenges in Kampala now are. And as I mentioned, it's a city that's growing really fast as buildings are having to adapt. Some of them are being destroyed, actually. And the only place left to build is these wetlands. As you see in this map, that's this blue area going in between the hills. And what we were proposing to do is to come in and not necessarily propose a solution, but understand what is actually going on in the wetlands and who's settling in the wetlands, what are the wetland settlements. So these were the brave students that chose this unit. The reason I call them brave is I hadn't been to the wetlands either, and so this really was something that we're all going to discover together. It was a journey we're taking together, and we didn't know what we're going to find. So anyway, that's us crossing Kampala Road. And then this is us in one of the wetland settlements. And what I'll say was very unique about this unit, and what I learned even about my own city, is I didn't realize that the many different activities that were going on. What we see here is brick making. These are brick kilns in the background. And in the back here, where you see the wetlands, eventually gets to the lake. There's sand mining, there's fishing, there's people making briquettes. There's all kinds of different activities going on. These communities are very vibrant, and then they're also building for themselves. So our challenge is, if we come in as architects or designers, what position do we have if people are already finding their own solutions where they are? And there's a video on Unit 15X. I won't show it here because it's on the GSA on Vimeo. So if you check the GSA Vimeo account, you'll find it there, and it will give you a summary of what the unit was about. But what I'll show here is one of the students' work. This is Elau Martin. And what he did was focus on those brick kilns and try to think of a latent potential within, which is that when the brick kilns are burnt, there's extra energy that's wasted. And so what this diagram is showing is what if you kind of had a way to feed back into, kind of create an ecosystem where the energy from the brick making perhaps could melt plastics, it could go into recycling of plastics, and basically kind of find a way that this could be a more sustainable process. Right now, there's a lot of extraction of materials, extraction of resources within the wetlands, and so the wetlands are getting depleted. So what this project was trying to propose is a way to make it an ecosystem that is much more sustainable. I should also mention that the main function of the wetlands is to filter water before it gets to Lake Victoria. And because they're being encroached upon and degraded, this filtering system is not working. The wetlands also soaked up water. So now there's more flooding because there's less square meters of wetlands. So it's a really important topic. What I'm hoping is that we could have an exhibition here, perhaps engage the local, the communities themselves and also the planning authorities into a discussion about what to do about the wetlands. And yeah, that's an idea for that. And then I'm going to talk quickly about what it's been like to build a practice in Kampala. This is a study that was done by the Commonwealth Association Architects, and what they found is that Kampala is, well, I'll just say Uganda, but it's mainly Kampala that is urbanizing really fast. That's why the red is really high. And then the number of architects, which is blue, you can't even see it here because we're so few. At this point, it was 178, but we're about 200 now. But still, that's a very small number of architects for the kind of population if you compare to some of the other countries. The other challenge is that there's very few academic institutions. In Uganda, there's 4 of them. There was only one that had an architecture program for a long time. The other, then Uganda Matters, which is about 10 years old. The rest are more or less 2 or 3 years old, very young architecture institutions. So with these challenges, I've set up a practice whereby we, I've found that a lot of training or peer-to-peer training has to happen, because when I hire Ugandan architects, there's always another layer of training that has to happen. And that's where these, I guess, international interns come in. These are different individuals that have been to Uganda. Some of them have done their thesis on topics in Kampala, which is interesting. And we kind of stay on having a working relationship. So the person from Germany and Norway are based in their countries, and we work online based on the project. And I found that this way of peer-to-peer mentoring and just having a practice that allows we call them graduate architects here. So you're a graduate architect before you become an architect. So an environment that allows the graduate architects to interact with each other and also with me, have found that this has been a good way to move forward with this. Some of the projects we do, this is an example where I partnered with Solar Grid, which is a company making solar powering that is very small. They're based in San Francisco, so they call themselves the iPhone for solar, because a solar battery is really huge, but they've invented a very small battery. So the idea is that we could apply it to a function like this. Right now, there are mobile clinics where doctors move from village to village, and they have to set up every time they move into a new area. So this was proposing, what if there was this truck that had the solar energy in the water, a very basic space within which they can see different clients each time they move. And so this is still, it's a prototype, and we're just looking for the right, I guess, health institution that would want to take this on, and so we can see how to implement it. This is another project. It's commercial on the first 2 floors and then residential above. And with this client, most of the commercial buildings, they want to use alucobon, like aluminum panels and glass. Everyone loves glass. Dubai is seen as a city that to aspire towards, so all the new builders, they want this Dubai, I call it Dubaism. So our big win with this project was to convince the client to build with brick, because this is on Entebbe Road and there's a really big clay factory right close to this site. And so just to be able to convince this client not to use glass and aluminum and to use a local brick, that was a big win for this project. And right now we're going through approvals and we're waiting for the next step. This is another project on affordable housing. Initially, my focus was affordable housing. I kind of found myself doing the preservation work, but affordable housing is always something in the background. We're always working on a project. It's a very challenging topic because there's land issues. There's also the density. The first affordable house we did was a sit-alone house, like a bungalow. But we've since learned that we can't propose bungalows anymore because the space, we really need to think about density. So with this project, we proposed apartments to this client. So this client also came saying they wanted bungalows. There's a culture here where people value land and they want their house on the ground. And so we're trying to push them to say, think about apartments, think about the densities. And so that's what this project is doing. Again, using local brick and local clay. This is the master plan for this project. Again, some formal. I would say the big move here is to separate the stairs from the buildings. So the buildings share the stairs and that way lower the cost. This is another render of the same building. And then I'll end with this project, which is for African mobilities. We called our section 3x3, and I'll explain why. It was a multidisciplinary collaboration for this project. African Mobilities is led by Mpho Matsipa, who teaches at WITS, and we were a regional collaborator on this project. This is the team, which includes actually Zahir, who also works he does the video at UJ. That's how I met him. What basically happened is we did this research for 4 months. It was 6 months project. For 4 months, we followed this one trader and explained why we picked him and gathered all this information. And then there was a struggle on how to communicate the information we've gathered. And so I sat down with Zahir, and he was very helpful in helping us tell a story. And I think as architects, sometimes we get caught up in drawings and maybe writings and readings, but there's always this next step. How are you going to communicate what you found? And I found that using videos is a very good tool in doing this. So in summary, we were looking at migrants and refugees. Kampala has a lot of them. One of the groups are Congolese, and most refugees move with the trade that they had from where they were before. And the Congolese trade in kitenge, the African fabric. So without taking too much time, let me just show you very quickly. The video will explain exactly what this project was about.
Salembe, I'm a Congolese by nationality, and I sell kitenge. Kitenge is a fabric made out of cotton with an African print on it, or any African idea.
Kitenge is truly a global artifact, once produced in Indonesia, Holland, West Africa, and now increasingly China. But it isn't just a fabric. To many Africans, it's a symbol of independence and of influence.
In 2011, that's when I moved from Goma, where I was born, to Kampala. I moved because of civil war going on in my country. Yeah, it forced me and my family together to move up to Kampala.
After arriving in Uganda as a refugee, the kitenge trade provided Elvis with an opportunity.
We Congolese, we are good at selling kitenge. We are born in kitenge society.
In order to maximize profits, many building owners in downtown Kampala tried to squeeze as many shops as possible into their buildings. As a result, most shops fit into a 3x3 meter space. Elvis's shop, however, was originally designed as a storage closet. It's even smaller, measuring 3 by 1 meters. By having fold-out counters, Elvis has expanded his space to the standard 3 by 3 meters.
When I wanted to make different shelves in my shop there, I considered the size of the fabric because I wanted to have many shelves so that I may display all the fabrics properly on the shelves. So I told the carpenter to measure the fabric and to make for me shelves according to the size of the fabric. That's how my shelves are a little bit squeezed.
The shelves are multifunctional. They serve not only as a display area, but also as a storage space and as a colorful attraction for his shop. The fabrics are arranged according to quality. There's a lot happening within this shop, with designated areas for the customer, salesperson, and pedestrians. To many, this tight space might seem like it's not enough. However, by meticulously maximizing every inch of the space, Elvis makes it work. Kitenge fabrics have made their way to the global fashion industry.
Back in the day, kitenge was something maybe your mom would wear or your grandma would wear. It was never anything that anyone young would even consider wearing. Things that were considered traditional are trending now, but I feel even before that, it was an international trend on internationally recognized catwalks. There's this movement about being proud of our heritage.
The kitenge trade has enabled the Congolese community in Kampala to challenge the dominant representations of refugees as victims by exerting an influence over the urban fashion and culture.
The more I sell materials, the more I also get ideas of different prints also. In the future, I think I'll be also going to the factory and place my own order so that I may also get the quantity. In 5 years, I think I'll be having a very big shop.
Elvis's work in the kitenge trade provides an example of ways in which the refugee enterprise is actively transforming the social, cultural, and built environment in cities such as Kampala, and at the same time, forging connections to the global economy. All this in 3 by 3 meters.
So the video was self-explanatory. I'll talk about it more, I guess, during the Q&A if you have questions. But in summary, I really learned a new methodology of how to approach projects by thinking very clearly how to communicate. For example, a lot of our conditions are very transient, a lot of things moving. So you can't simply draw a plan or a section. I found the collages helped explain what was going on in the neighborhood. I also found that, these kinds of drawings, axons, because as I said, Elvis's shop is a closet, more or less, 1 by 3 meters, but during the day he unfolds it, it becomes 3 by 3. So one drawing, one plan doesn't explain this. It needs a different type of drawing technique to explain what's exactly going on. And so since this project, which was also about 2 years ago, with each project I've tried to make new kinds of drawings, and also we've tried to make a short video to explain exactly what we're doing, just as an approach to the projects. And then I'm going to end with this, just as a comment, that the most recent workshop we've done, which just ended, was during the lockdown. As we all know, we're going through this pandemic, and it was the very first time that we were engaging with the site remotely. And what we see here is Nakasero Market. It's the most vibrant market in Kampala, and they adapted by reorganizing themselves to have social distancing. What you see there is they've measured and put lines to have the 5 by 5 meters square, sorry, 2 by 2 meters square. I'll share the video soon. It's coming out in about a week. We don't have it ready now. But this is just to touch on how we've had to now adapt to the new situation we all find ourselves in, but still try to continue doing the same work. And with that, I think it brings us to an end. Thank you.